There you have it in a nutshell, the basics of God: marriage, family, meals, and glorious presence. Mankind equipped to make eternal living with God forever pleasant. Worship, a world word. Not merely a church word. Creation, a cosmic home beyond building or earthly thrones. Call it a paradigm shift for your melon. Because these timeless principles are always threatened within the world we live in, however. Come hell or high water, these basics can't fade or enhance. They will always thrive in any time, any place, or under any circumstance. But we all know the story. Hell and high water came. Humanity decided and kept deciding they didn't like what God made, so the apple fell. And Cain fell Abel. Sibling rivalry, murder, contention, sin proved fatal. Our cowardice to always one-up each other proved unable to bring back life stable. Tidal waves of flood and fortune swept hearts away. Whether one summited the heights or plummeted the depths, it only led to more discontent. Fallen worship. Notice the diagram. It visually represents, see the reversed arrow, it no longer directs people out, but back in. Calling, collecting, and gathering humanity back from their sin, back from the dead. God raised up a tent, later to become tabernacle, a miniature picture of what had happened in humanity's heart and marrow. People had settled for a new home, settling for the disparity of the outer courts. A life lived away from the presence of God, the new norm. Humanity had been infected with cancer, separation, and divide, seemingly a problem without answer. People's worship twisted, perverted, and fallen. Time spent running away from God's basics brought amnesia. God's garden forgotten. Humanity wasting themselves in all things unclean, needing a path out of complexity. Sin always complicates things. They needed a path back into simplicity, back to the holy, back to their king. The question surfaces again. Would God abandon his original plans, purposes, and promises from back then? The answer is no. He set up the image of the tent, culminating later in the tabernacle, to put on a show, a visual painting, pointing to how the rivers of Eden might once again flow. People were to come to the entrance, no matter how broken and brazen. To the altar they'd come and remember that their sins were treason, criminal acts deserving death, a much worse avoidance tactic than meth. Rather than judgment, God graciously offered rest, a reset. "Bring me an animal sacrifice," he cried. Over the altar it must stretch, dying, a symbol of why humans must die. A life for a life, this animal's breath in exchange for human pride. Once the glorious smoke filled the sky and all around visualized their spared and forgiven life, they came to the basin, the water, symbolizing ocean and sea, and were taught that their confession and God's considerable mention made them clean. Confession, clean. Words feeling so free, they smelled like a potion, the possible notion that God might be, turning back time, wiping separation away, back to the days where his word, meals, and light were fragrances sweet and our soul delight. But sadly, not quite. The fullness of time still hadn't arrived. People still choosing to run from the light. Death and turmoil still kept erupting on earth, for you already know the verse. Every headline played over and over just makes it worse. Sibling against sibling, family against family, nation against nation, multiplying enemies. What this movie still needs is someone to hit the final reverse. Though God's relentless pursuit and tent proved faithful, his people learned to resent and become only more despicable. They kept reaching for a version of a God more stable. They found only lesser loves, idols, and danger. So in the days of Samuel, their disdain of God peaked. Crying out loud, they wailed, "Make us a king!" They screamed to make humanity bigger than Trinity, and through tears God obliged, only to teach. that on the other side of such mountainous screams is only disappointment in hoping in such things. But hope joyously remained. Sneakily, God did not abandon his plan to lead in meals, marriage, family, and glory. At every juncture of cultural change, when God's people tried to dream up a new way, he turned back the dial before our denial took place, showing us he's the same. Underneath the human radar he plays, and despite the complaining ring, he smuggled into the world the offices of prophets, priests, and kings. A covert trinity of sorts, a trifecta regime pointing back to the peace, a smell intended to fragrantly waft from the home since the very beginning. Prophets to teach rightly in precept, priests to kindly serve the people, and kings to oversee policies that reveal the Father and Spirit, Son, eternal. But the story wrapped the same rhyme. Progressing all the way up to the fullness of time, humanity tried to eject God's design. False prophets clouded clear precept. Priests became Pharisees and made people into rejects. Take, for example, Herod the king, a king thirsting for blood. By blood, an Israelite, what did you expect? Humanity still presumptuously assumed they had the liberty to do it, take God's job in hand and try to make it more perfect. In all their creativity to try and innovate better, they turned God's gifts, image, and office into experiments more toxic. All the while, the simplicity of the garden, posit, marriage, family, meals, and glory were threatened as though lost in it. But hope joyously remained. The New Testament dawns. A light so supersonic runs on the horizon, comes like the Son of Man, Jesus the Son, coming by the will of the Father, in the power of the Spirit's love. Not an I, but a we, a holy trinity, a relational family of friends, face-to-face love, a Father, Spirit, Son, a lover, beloved, and their expression as one, living together in glory, harmony, a perfect unity in diversity, crossing into our hell and high water, crossing wet in baptism and baptizing with fire. The challenge to every legend, lunatic, and liar comes the Lord, the true prophet restored, bringing love and precept. The high priest reversing what had become of humanity because of Adam's defect, the great king of every aspect, comes, but not as one might expect. Misinterpretation had led people to look for a power-hungry Messiah, a political ruler. Living in palaces and feasting on papaya, they expected him to inhabit their synagogue buildings and use fancy rings to elect them as officials, princes, perhaps kings. But he came. His name? Bridegroom. Notice the image, marriage. His name? Friend of sinners and brother. Notice the image, family. He came eating and drinking. Notice the provision, meals, a servant Lord. He came feasting with prisoners, despots, fishermen, and whores. I wonder if just like them, we're still looking for more. But despite their wrong vision, he came with concision. It says, considering equality with God nothing to be grasped, he considered himself nothing. Because of this humility, his name is now exalted in glory. This is his story, God dwelling with man. Notice the trajectory. Our prophet, priest, and king didn't change the triangle story. He didn't alter the allegory. He reversed it back to the garden intention and didn't say, sorry. So one more detail we must note. It's of his last offering, the final example Christ left us before dying, rising, and ascending. On the night before his death, the Lord's Supper, there he goes, feasting again. Jesus raised up a message, the cup and bread, knowing exactly what was in his head. In case you're wondering what the meal meant in the confusion of how history has mixed up Jesus' intent, Luke writes down the event, different from any author, so we can understand. Two cups Jesus raised. Here's the first one. Echoes of two basics first placed, originating in the garden's grace. Displayed in red is that humanity needs a bond with their Creator. Provision. From the tippy-top grapes on the vine down to slithering slugs, the first cup is a symbol of our broken bond with our King. After falling into sin, our need reaches deeper than stomach and feed. But hope joyously speaks, for he comes back to us like marriage, you must see. Ponder the first cup's imagery. To the Jew, it was filled with meaning, as for us it also should be. A Jewish groom, when wanting to marry a girl, would first wait, pray, and tarry. After building up enough courage, he'd bring the father gifts, and if accepted by the father, the true lovers would marry. Acceptance of the groom by the father was signaled by the spilling of wine. And the groom would then leave to prepare a place for his bride. She'd light her lamps and wait for him to prepare a place for her by his side, and wait till he whisked her away in the night. The symbol in the first cup is clear, that it signals the purchase of people's lives. It's a symbol and promise deep as marriage, and how we are to wait for Christ. 2, we needed a shelter, protection. The second cup Christ raises speaks to a Gentile convention. We should also pay attention. They understood kingdom as one of feasting galore. But in their meals and clubs, however, they'd hang with the popular crowd, nothing more. They'd kick out the prisoners, despots, lower class, anyone different from them, and they'd make horrible use of the whore. They'd spill wine and hail Caesar as Lord, as they dripped wine on the floor. In raising the second cup himself, Jesus battles this folklore. He hails himself as King and Lord, a different kind of king. He throws water in the face of anyone claiming otherwise. He invites all those to his table who are lesser than, widowed, fatherless, or despised. So what did Jesus do before his death on the cross ensued? Look at the graphic. He prepared a table before us, food. An endless supply of mealtimes to smell, speaking of how his creation is different than the one we've made it into, our own little hell. He's given us a house, oh no, not a mansion, not one made by human hands, nor Eden do tell. He gives us himself, glory. Now we eat with him, in our hearts he dwells. Check out one more detail. Paul picks up Jesus' imagery in 1 Corinthians. Follow his logic as he moves toward his big idea in chapter 13, love. Chapter 10 starts with a reminder to the people of Israel's history. Not just a timeline of their exile or slavery, but a history of food and drink. Paul then goes on to speak of worship in chapter 11 as he understood it to be. He clearly thinks of the Lord's Supper as the church service itself and the context for unbelievers and believers alike to come face to face with their King. He links the Christian feasting to the pagan feasts. Clearly their church service was a full meal, you see. He counsels the church they are to eat and meet differently than the world. For you see, some were coming to the supper so rich in prosperity that they were getting drunk and gluttonously full, while the poor and less fortunate starved. Paul said, discern the body. It means stop only thinking of yourself and serve somebody else. Another body part in need. Whereas the pagan feasts were celebrations of wealth and greed unto their false idols, Christian feasting and worship were to be linked, not to consuming and injustice, but to producing and meeting needs justly. Paul immediately spends the next chapters talking about how the eating community was to begin also making together as a body, creating together. Another echo of the garden that we've altogether lost in our day. We're too busy pushing through Bible studies and schedules with very little room for play. Paul called these offerings the creative way, spiritual ministries. Many today call them spiritual gifts. My oh my, how we've misinterpreted this. They're anything but individual superpowers and play toys. They're the body working together in love and joy. Everybody contributing and making, all in the name of love. Now Paul's conclusion. He reminds them of love within the meal. Then he ends by reminding them of the resurrection and the day that Jesus would again come, the reveal. His line of logic suggests that meals are the way the church continues to meet and grow till the day everything is done. In the mind of Jesus, Paul, and those in the early church up to the late 4th century, the meal was where believer and unbeliever alike received blessing, remembering Christ. And doing mission amongst the sinner and poor were not daytime activities and nighttime activities, separated between stage and floor. But worship and mission were the same, together, one. My, how the state of church in our day has run from the basics. We reframe it, we isolate. Believers here at church, sinners come to the soup kitchens. We minister down as if to say the unsaved need me, I don't need them. The hierarchy of ministry, that's the new trend. It's a ministry of converting, not one of family and friend. There you have it in a nutshell. The basics of God continuing on from the beginning confirmed. Marriage, family, meals, and glorious presence. These basics remain the foundations of the church. Jesus gave the word. In many ways, our denominational and institutional merch has altered the timeless image with timely widgets. In our next section, we need to discuss how to fix it. In modern day, the church as an entity has been on a rampage, the same as the world, against family. And it's time we relive it, the garden, the basics. Call it a paradigm shift for your melon, because these timeless principles have been threatened within the local church and world models we now live in. However, come hell or high water, these basics can't fade or enhance in any time, any place, or under any circumstance.